The Alpha King didn't choose her out of cruelty. He chose her out of calculation. Every noblewoman who entered that chamber screamed until dawn, or didn't scream at all. The beast left nothing behind. No survivor. No witness. Just silence. And another name, crossed off a list no one was supposed to know existed. Elara was not a noblewoman. She was a healer's apprentice who had ended up in the wrong room on the wrong night, carrying nothing but a candle stub and a satchel of herbs. The king expected her name to be crossed off by morning. Instead, she walked out. And the beast, the one thing in 6 years that had never once shown mercy, had let her. So why did the Alpha King look more threatened by her survival than relieved? Drop a comment below. Do you think he already knew something about her that she didn't know herself? The candle in Elara's hand had burned to a stub by the time she reached Ashenvale's eastern wing. 3 days through mountain passes thick with November ice, 2 broken wagon wheels, 1 very offended mule, and now this. The torchlight barely reached the floor. The stones beneath her boots were slick with cold that had no business existing inside a castle. She shifted her healer's satchel higher and tried to remember which direction the head guard had pointed. 2nd corridor, 3rd door on the left. Or had it been the 3rd corridor? She'd been awake for 19 hours. She found what looked like the 3rd door, lifted the iron latch, and pushed. The hinges didn't make a sound. In a castle this old, every door announced itself. Elara stepped through, thinking of nothing but her cot and the Abbey's fire back home. And the door swung shut behind her, with a boom that traveled up through her legs and into her spine. The bolt slid home. The sound of it was the loneliest noise she had ever heard. She turned. This was not a corridor. The darkness here had weight. It pressed against her ears, her skin, the backs of her eyes. Her candle stub caught the edge of stone walls, flickering in a draft that came from nowhere. The ceiling swallowed the light before it could reach it. She knocked, called out. The sound didn't echo. It fell dead, absorbed the way stones absorb water. Then, from somewhere ahead in the black, a breath. Not hers. Long, slow, patient as winter. Elara did not scream. She was a healer's apprentice, which meant she had held the hands of dying people and looked directly at pain that would have made a soldier flinch. She had learned, at 15, that panic cost 30 seconds of clarity she could not afford. She lifted the candle. The flame caught a shape in the far corner, and for one moment, her carefully trained composure cracked straight down the middle. It was enormous, not merely large, but filling the space the way a coming storm fills the sky before the thunder arrives. Dark fur, shoulders that could have belonged to a bear, if bears were built like nightmares. And eyes, when it turned toward the light, burning the color of iron fresh from the forge. Red, steady, watching her with an intelligence no animal should have owned. Her candle arm dropped an inch. She caught it. Breathe. Count. 1, 2, 3. On 3, she noticed the rest. Across the creature's shoulder, visible where the light landed, where something had kept the fur from growing back, a scar, and another, a third running diagonal across its ribs. Not clean scars. These were layered, overlapping, the kind that came from someone who had wanted to cause pain and had all the time in the world to do it precisely. The healer's instinct in her moved before fear could stop it. Someone has been hurting this creature, systematically, for a long time. It stood. The full height of it hit her like cold water. Taller than any wolf, taller than a destrier, and yet it moved with a stillness that was nothing like an animal's. Animals fidgeted. Animals tracked you with their whole body. This thing moved one step toward her and then stopped. And the way it stopped was a choice. Her throat was dry. Her heart was loud in her ears. But her voice, when it came, surprised her. She spoke the words her abbess had taught her for patients who were past reason, the ones who had been afraid so long that fear was the only language left. Latin. Old Latin. The kind that predated the kingdom by 3 centuries. A healer's cadence, though it carried no magic, only intention. Ego non timeo te, she said, barely above a whisper. I am not afraid of you. The creature stopped. Ego video vulnera tua. I see your wounds. The red eyes held, did not blink. The chamber was absolutely silent, except for both of them breathing, hers fast and shallow, its long and slow. And then something happened that Elara would spend the next 3 months trying to properly explain. The creature lowered its head, not in submission, not in threat, in something that looked, in the flickering light, like exhaustion, like recognition, like someone who had been in the dark long enough to forget their own name, suddenly hearing it spoken aloud. Elara's hand moved before she decided to move it. Healer's hands. They went toward what needed them. She crossed the chamber 1 step at a time, watching its eyes, speaking Latin in a quiet stream. I see you. You are not nothing. I'm going to look at this wound. And when she was close enough, when the heat radiating from its body hit her in a wave she hadn't expected, she reached up and placed her palm against the largest scar on its shoulder. The world detonated. Not with sound, with feeling. A wave of something so vast it had no name. Pain built over years, layer upon layer. The kind of suffering that had stopped feeling like suffering and started feeling like the air itself. And beneath it, disoriented and fractured and unbelievably still present, a pulse that was unmistakably human, not metaphorically human, a consciousness, a self. Reaching toward her through the dark, the way roots reach toward water in a drought. Then the ground came up and hit her, and everything stopped. She woke on cold stone to the sound of iron hinges. Morning light, gray, reluctant, the particular light of northern November, fell through the open doorway in a single shaft. In it stood a soldier, older, with the kind of face that had seen enough to stop being surprised. Behind him, a younger guard, very pale. The older one, she would learn his name was Magnus, looked at her, then at the empty corner of the chamber, then back at her. Something passed through his expression that he immediately locked away. On your feet, miss. Quiet, careful, like someone diffusing something. Elara sat up, her head pounded. Her satchel was still on her shoulder. The corner of the chamber was empty, but she could feel something she had never felt before, a warmth at the back of her mind, distant and faint, like an ember on the other side of a wall, like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. She pressed her fingers to her sternum. The warmth pressed back. King Aldrich will want to see you, Magnus said. Now. The great hall of Ashenvale smelled of pine resin, tallow candles, and the particular anxiety of a room full of people pretending not to be anxious. Elara walked in with mud on her boots and a bruise forming on her left elbow, and every face turned toward her, like compass needles finding north. She was 22 years old, her dark hair still half unraveled from its braid, her gray dress wrinkled past saving. She had the look, her abbess always said, of someone who was paying attention even when she appeared not to be. She was paying very close attention now. On the dais at the far end, on a throne of dark iron and northern oak, sat the king. She had heard the stories. Aldrich Dre, the grieving king, the one who had watched his older brother Caelian disappear 6 years ago, presumed dead, and had locked the beast he found in Caelian's chambers ever since, certain it was the cause. 28 years old and already wearing authority like a second skin. She had expected someone defined by rage. What she saw, from across 40 feet of stone floor, was a man sitting very still on a throne that dwarfed him, wearing the expression of someone accustomed to controlling everything, who had just encountered something he could not. His jaw was set. His eyes, dark silver gray in the flat northern light, fixed on her with an intensity that made the backs of her knees uncertain. He was, her treacherous mind noted, absolutely stunning. Not beautiful the way the nobles around him were beautiful, careful, manicured, ornamental. He was beautiful the way the mountains outside were beautiful, all hard line and dark weather, the kind of face that had never thought about trying. Sharp jaw, dark hair, shoulders under his black surcoat that suggested someone who had learned to fight long before he'd learned to rule. She made herself look at the room instead. Beside the throne stood Seraphine Vale, the court sorceress. Midnight hair, a face like a verdict, eyes running calculations Elara couldn't see. And stepping forward from the assembled nobility, with the smile of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, Lady Isolde of House Varen. Blonde, polished, wearing a gown that had cost more than the Abbey's library. "This is the creature who interfered with my trial," Isolde announced. "I was in that chamber, performing an assigned task for the crown, and this healer's apprentice, forced her way in and ruined everything." "I was locked in by accident," Elara said, because she had decided in the corridor that the only strategy available to her was the truth. The guard, "Silence," said Isolde. "Had been drinking," Elara continued, at the same volume, watching Isolde's composure tighten. "And confused the keys. I didn't choose to enter that chamber. I didn't choose to spend a night on a stone floor in the dark. And yet you survived." The voice from the dais was quiet, with an edge underneath that had nothing to do with volume. The room went still. Aldrich had not moved from his throne. He watched her with those storm cloud eyes, and the look on his face was not the coldness she'd expected. It was something stranger, something that looked like hunger, like a question that had been burning a very long time. "I survived," Elara confirmed. "No one survives a night in that chamber." His voice was flat, almost informational. 3 years of trials, not a single competitor. "Then, perhaps," Elara said carefully, "someone should ask why." The silence stretched. Seraphine made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Isolde's beautiful face went sharp. "She's clearly a witch. There is no other." "Enough!" One word from Aldrich, landing like a dropped blade. Isolde's mouth closed. The room breathed out. He descended the dais steps, unhurried. The crowd parted. Elara held her ground. She had nowhere to go, and besides, something in the back of her mind had just flared with warmth, like encouragement from a direction she couldn't name. Aldrich stopped in front of her. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. The breadth of him, the coiled quiet of him, the way he looked at her, without the assessment or dismissal she'd learned to expect from powerful men. He was actually seeing her. It was disconcerting in a way she couldn't name. "How long?" he asked Seraphine, without breaking his gaze from Elara. "Full dark to dawn, Your Majesty. A complete night." Something moved through Aldrich's jaw. "Then by the laws of the Red Trials, she qualifies." The room erupted. Elara barely heard it. She was watching his face, watching the controlled blankness of it slip, just for a second, into something that looked like relief. Raw and badly hidden, and clearly not meant for anyone to see. "You may refuse," he said, beneath the noise. His voice dropped just enough that it was for her alone. "Return to wherever you came from. Walk away." In the back of her mind, the ember surged. Not a word, not a feeling with a clear name, just stay. Desperate and wordless and achingly human, from somewhere below the castle floor. "I accept," Elara said. Aldrich held her gaze for one more second, his expression a closed door, then turned back to his court. They gave her rooms, an actual fireplace, actual linen, a window seat padded in midnight blue. She sat on it and pressed her palm to her sternum and tried to understand what was living in her chest. A heartbeat. She was certain of it. Slow and steady and distinctly not hers. Healers learned their own pulse before anything else, and this one was deeper, lower. It had the quality of something very large and very old, trying to be very quiet. "Are you there?" she whispered, feeling the absurdity of it. Nothing. A warmth, steady as a banked fire. Presence, without communication. Mira arrived on the second day, having ridden hard from the abbey the moment she'd received Elara's letter. Mira, who was 2 years older and had been her closest friend since childhood, who had a laugh like a door banging in a storm and an instinct for trouble that served as Elara's primary warning system. She swept in, took one look at Elara's face and said, "Tell me everything." Elara told her. Mira sat through it without interrupting, which was how Elara knew she understood the gravity. "So," Mira said finally, "there's a heartbeat in your chest that isn't yours, coming from the dungeon creature everyone thinks murdered the previous king." "Disappeared," Elara corrected. "Prince Caelian, King Caelian, disappeared 6 years ago. Aldrich found the beast in his chambers. He assumed the worst." "You think he was wrong?" "I think those scars weren't made by a fight." Elara looked at her hands. "They were made over time, by someone with keys." Mira's expression shifted. Then she stood, straightened her riding cloak, and said, "Right. We need to find out what's actually down there." It was Mira who found the narrow gap, behind the tall shelving unit in the castle library, where 2 stone blocks had settled unevenly over centuries. 2 fingers wide, cold air moving through it from below. "It goes down," Mira said, her ear against the stone. "Deep." Elara wrote a note. Small, tight script. "Ego hic sum, non timeo." She rolled it thin and pushed it through. That night, the heartbeat in her chest was steady but searching, like a hand feeling along a wall in the dark. In the morning, she pressed her fingers into the gap and found a chip of stone, flat, small, with 3 symbols scratched into its surface by something harder than rock. Mira went pale when she saw them. She crossed to the library's oldest shelf and pulled out a text so fragile its spine had long since surrendered. "Old Dravinian," she said. "The written language of the first royal family. Dead for 2 generations." She traced the symbols carefully. "I hear you." They looked at each other across the stone chip. "He's in there," Elara said, not a question. "Something in there has the education of a royal court," Mira said, very carefully. "Elara, what exactly did you put your hand on?" The exchange became a ritual. Elara wrote in Latin. Mira translated the old Dravinian responses scratched onto stone chips. She could only imagine with what, those dark claws. At the library table, with the kind of focus that left shadows under her eyes. "Are you in pain?" "No." "The shoulder wound? Inflammation?" "No." "How long have you been here?" "Too long." "Do you remember the world before?" "Fragments." "On the 4th day. I found a portrait, the young king, first year of reign. The caption was faded. Who was he?" She hadn't been looking for a portrait. She'd been trying to find the dining room. She still couldn't locate it without help. And the painting had caught her eye because of the way the figure stood. That quality of absolute stillness, even captured in oil, that she recognized from a dungeon chamber by candlelight. 6 hours later, 2 symbols came back through the gap. Mira translated them and was quiet for a long time. "My brother." The library was very still. Elara sat with the stone chip in her palm and felt the heartbeat in her chest shift. Something slow and heavy moving through it, the way ice moves when a river begins to thaw. "Mira," she said, "he's not the beast that killed the king. He is the king." That night she lay in the dark, with the fire burned to coals, and instead of pushing a note through the gap, simply thought in the direction of the warmth in her chest. "I'm still here." The silence lasted long enough that she thought she'd imagined everything. Then, like something breathed through solid stone, like a voice that had forgotten how to be a voice. She heard it. Not with her ears. "What are you reading?" She sat up so fast she nearly fell off the bed. The voice was low, rough with disuse rather than harshness. It landed somewhere behind her eyes, real and impossible at once. "Nothing," she thought back, feeling ridiculous. I put the book down. I was thinking. About what? Her pulse was in her fingertips. About portraits, dead languages, whether the person I've been writing to knows what I found. The warmth in her chest tightened, not painfully, but the way a rope tightens when weight is placed on it slowly. "You found the portrait?" "Yes." "Then you know." "Not a question. I need you to say it." The pause that followed was long. Then, careful as a man placing weight on ice he isn't sure will hold. "My name is Caelian. Caelian Dre. I was king of Dravenmore." She pressed both hands to her sternum. Below the floor, somewhere in the dark, the heartbeat steadied. "I know," she said. "I'll figure out the rest." The second trial came with a full day's warning and no other mercy. "The broken bridge," Seraphine announced. An iron chain crossing above a gorge no one had ever bothered to measure. At the far end, a locked chamber. The door sealed with old Dravenian cipher marks. Whoever retrieved the object inside and returned with it would advance. The trick, which Seraphine didn't say aloud but everyone understood. No one alive could read Old Dravenian. Elara kept her face neutral and felt the heartbeat in her chest quicken, just slightly, in a rhythm that wasn't quite hers. "I know those marks," Caelian said that evening, after she'd described the cipher. "Almost know them. Like reading in a dream. The shapes are there, but the meaning comes and goes. The outer ring is a lock sequence, sunrise direction. If I could see them." "You'll see them through me," she said. A pause. Then, "Yes, I suppose I will." The gorge was everything the word promised, and worse. Elara stood at its edge, in thin gray morning light, and thought very carefully about nothing. The bridge. Iron chains strung between stone anchors, planks bolted between them. The whole structure built by someone not required to use it personally, swayed in the wind rising from the dark below. Isolde had gone first, moving with the careful precision of someone coached in advance. She had resources Elara didn't. A private scholar, an informant. Of course she did. Elara stepped onto the first plank. The chain moved under her feet. Wind hit her sideways and she grabbed the rope rail, felt the iron bite cold through her gloves, cold that traveled up her wrists and into her arms. Below her, she didn't look but her body knew, was a drop, with no opinion about whether she survived it. "Step center of each plank," Caelian said. "The outside chains are older." "How do you know?" "I've been here before. Aldrich dared me to cross it when I was 17. "Did you?" "I ran across it. I was an idiot." Despite everything, Elara almost smiled. "Were you scared?" "Terrified." I didn't tell him that. She moved plank by plank, hand over hand on the rope rail, the wind trying to peel her off like bark from a tree. The heartbeat in her chest was faster now, hers and his blurring into a single rhythm. She focused on his voice instead of the dark below. "Second anchor from center. Right chain is loose. Step left." "Don't trust the rail there." She stepped left. The right section of the bridge shuddered as Isolde, 3 planks ahead, put her full weight on the weakened chain. The crack of stressed iron, and Isolde grabbed the rail with both hands, chest pressed to the planks, completely frozen. Not fallen, but frozen. "Is she injured?" Caelian asked. "Frightened." Elara kept moving until she was level with Isolde, until she could see the white knuckles of the other woman's hands. "Lady Isolde." Isolde didn't look at her. "Keep moving. The chain will hold if you distribute your weight evenly." Elara reached over and repositioned Isolde's grip on the rail. "Don't look down. Look at the far anchor." A long beat. Then Isolde, very stiffly. I don't need. Look at the anchor, Elara said. Move. She talked Isolde through the worst section with the same flat, practical voice she used with patients in crisis, not thinking about the fact that this woman had tried to have her removed from the competition 3 days ago. When they both stepped onto the far platform, Isolde said nothing. But something had changed in her eyes, a recalibration, an assessment being quietly revised. The chamber at the far end was carved from the rock face, barely large enough for 2 people without touching. The door, covered in cipher marks, concentric rings of old Dravinian, precise and ancient. Elara stood before them, held her hand close without touching, and said quietly, I'm looking at them. What do you see? The outer ring first. Sunrise direction. From the bottom. 3rd symbol left, then the one directly above it. Then... He trailed off. Wait, I know this room. You've been here? Aldrich and I found it when we were boys. We weren't supposed to be this far from the castle. Neither of us would admit we were lost. A pause that felt softer than his others, and somehow more painful. He laughed when we found the door. Said it looked like a puzzle. He always loved puzzles. He solved it. I watched and learned the sequence because he said that was the point. Knowledge is only useful if you share it. She stood very still, holding the memory of a boy who had grown into someone living in the dark below his own castle. Tell me the sequence. He did. She moved through it, pressing each symbol in order. They depressed into the stone with sounds like held breath being released, and when the last one clicked home, the door opened onto a room that smelled of old incense and cold brass. On a stone plinth, a fragment of hearthstone, deep amber, shot through with veins of light that pulsed like something alive. Elara picked it up and felt warmth against her palm that had nothing to do with the stone's temperature. Caelian. I know. His voice was soft. Bring it back safely. She stepped back into the wind. She was the first competitor to return with the object. As she crossed back through the gorge mouth, she found Aldrich standing apart from his court, arms crossed, watching her with those gray eyes she was beginning to understand were only gray when he was keeping himself from showing what lived underneath them. When her gaze found his, he did not look away first. She placed the hearthstone fragment in Seraphine's hands. Seraphine's fingers closed around it, and she looked at Elara for a moment, with an expression complex enough to be written in multiple languages on the same page. The second trial is complete, Seraphine announced. Elara Voss advances. Isolde emerged empty-handed 20 minutes later. As she passed Elara in the crowd, her shoulder briefly touched Elara's, and she didn't redirect it. Aldrich ate dinner with the methodical efficiency of a man who considered eating a task to be completed. He'd summoned Elara with a folded note in handwriting that was clean and direct, and somehow managed to contain his entire personality in 6 words. Your presence at dinner, tonight, 8th bell. The private dining room, 1 table, 2 chairs, an enormous fire. First snow of the season falling outside in the dark, soft and indifferent. He stood when she entered. She hadn't expected that. Sit, he said, not rudely, but he was a man for whom most things existed as directives. They ate in the careful silence of 2 people with a great deal to say, both waiting to see who spoke first. A servant brought wine, dark red, from southern vineyards that wouldn't survive another bad winter. It was Aldrich, eventually. He was 7 years older than me. He looked at the fire, not the beast, not the creature. He. The pronoun landed in Elara's chest like a stone in still water, and she kept her face very still. When we were boys, he left false trails for me through the castle. Moved things, left notes. He called it a game. I think he was teaching me to pay attention. I was not prepared for the day the trail went cold. Elara set down her fork. Aldrich. He looked at her sharply, not because she'd used his name without a title, she thought, but because she'd used it gently, and he wasn't sure what to do with that. "When you found the beast in his chambers 6 years ago," she said carefully, "what exactly did you find?" He was quiet for a moment. Destruction. His rooms torn apart. The creature there, where Caelian should have been. No other sign of him. His jaw tightened. "I made the only conclusion available to me." "But you never found a body." "No. And in 6 years, the creature has never tried to escape, never attacked a guard unprovoked." She held his gaze. "Whatever you think you know about what happened, I think you're missing something. I need to see him." The fire cracked. The snow fell. Aldrich looked at her for a long time, with an expression like a door deciding whether to open. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of its kingship entirely. Just a man, standing in front of a grief he'd been living inside so long he'd started to confuse it for a house. 10 minutes, he said. "Magnus will take you." She did not say thank you. She recognized that he didn't want gratitude. He wanted it to mean something. 10 minutes, she agreed. The dungeon was simply deep, beneath the earth, beneath the foundations, lit by torches at intervals. At the bottom of the final stair, beyond an iron-barred door Magnus unlocked with a key on a separate ring from all the others, was a space that had once been storage and had been converted into something a large creature could not escape. Caelian was standing at the far wall. She had seen him once, by a candle stub, from the distance of raw panic. This was different. She had a proper torch, and she stood at the bars and looked, knowing now who she was looking at. He was immense, not just in size but in presence, the way a coming storm takes up the sky. Dark fur, dark claws, that great head turned toward her with those burning red eyes. She had been hearing his voice for days. She had learned the cadence of his silences. "Caelian," she said. He moved toward the bars in the way he always moved, deliberate, controlled, the opposite of what a caged animal was supposed to look like. He stopped just inside arm's reach. Through the bars and through 6 feet of iron-cold air, she could feel the heat of him. "You're looking at the scars," he said, in her head. "Cleaner now. Cleaner every day, as though the connection between them was a path being cleared with use." "Yes," she reached into her satchel. "I brought something." A particular silence. Then, "Elara. Arnica and calendula in beeswax, for scarring." She met his eyes through the bars. "I spent 6 days learning Old Dervenian to talk to you. You can spend 10 minutes not arguing with me." Something in the silence shifted, a pause that was trying with dignity not to be amused. Then slowly, he moved closer to the bars and lowered his massive shoulder to the height of her hands. Up close, the scarring was worse than candlelight had shown. Layered, old scars beneath newer ones, the topography of repeated, deliberate pain. She uncapped the tin and began to work the ointment in, with steady hands trained to stay steady. The heat of him against her palms was startling. Not the cold of a dungeon creature. Something alive, something with enormous warmth, like sitting too close to a forge. She had to consciously remind her lungs to keep working. His breathing changed, not much. But she felt it through the connection, a shift in the slow tide of the heartbeat she'd been carrying. She kept her hands moving. "Does it hurt?" she asked, finding a place where the scarring was raised and rough. "No. Tell me if it does." "Elara, I mean it." A pause. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. "It doesn't hurt." He stopped. She waited. "I had forgotten," he said, "what it felt like to be touched without the intent to cause damage." The tin was very still in her hand. The torchlight moved. Above them the castle existed, with its politics, and its trials, and its grief. Down here, for this moment, there was only the warmth of him under her palms, and the thing she was learning to name. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said, when she'd worked through everything she could reach. She capped the tin, but didn't step back. Not yet. He lifted his head and looked at her, those red eyes very close. She couldn't read the expression on a face not built for human expression. But in her chest, the shared heartbeat did something complicated. Something that thought, later, in her room with the fire burning low, might have been the first time she felt something from him that wasn't pain. "All right," Caelian said. She made herself step back. All the way back, and walked up the stairs, pressing her fingertips to her palm where his warmth had been, feeling the residue of it cooling in the dungeon air. She came back the next day, and the day after. It became, without either of them deciding it, a ritual. Elara with her torch and satchel, the bars between them, the ointment that gave them an excuse they had both long since stopped needing. The third evening, she asked what he remembered. He was quiet for a long time. She had learned his silences by now, could feel the difference between looking for words and "don't want to answer this." "Fragments," he said finally. "The dining hall in summer, when the light comes through the western windows at the right angle. A gray horse, with a habit of biting anyone who wasn't me. The smell of the library when it rained." Aldrich's face when he laughed. He laughed with his whole body. It annoyed me endlessly. She kept her hands moving. And after? There was nothing after. Pain, darkness, no time. And then there was a voice, speaking old Latin in the dark. She said nothing. It was the first human thing I had heard in, I didn't know how long. No way to know. But the voice sounded like someone who genuinely wanted to know whether I was in pain. Not many people had ever asked that. She looked up. His red eyes were very close. She had stopped being able to tell, at this proximity, where the bars were. "People who were supposed to ask," she said quietly, "were looking at a beast." "Yes." "I looked at the wounds," she said. "The wounds were more interesting." Something moved through the connection between them. Not words, not feeling, but both at once. She turned back to her work before she could decide what it meant. Mira found the text 3 days before the third trial. A book wrapped in oilskin, so old the binding had surrendered entirely. "There is a curse," she said, sitting across from Elara at the library table. "Court magic. It works through symbolic displacement. You intend it for one person, but if the conditions aren't exactly right, it binds to whoever is most physically present in the target space." She met Elara's eyes. Someone meant it for Aldrich, but Caelian was in the room. The library hearth cracked. Outside, snow fell steadily. "The book describes how it breaks," Mira continued, pressing her hand flat on the open page. "Specifically, curses of this magnitude can only be undone by someone who encounters the cursed form without preconception, without fear, who sees not the curse but the person beneath it, who chooses them, fully aware of what they are." Elara thought about a dungeon cell, and 10 minutes that had stretched to an hour, and a voice that said it was the first human thing I had heard. "Who cast it?" she asked. "I think you already suspect." She did. She had, for a while. The way Seraphine watched every interaction between Elara and the trials, the calculation in those precise eyes, and underneath it, in unguarded moments, something that looked like desperate hope wearing a mask of control. "She designed the trials," Elara said, "to find exactly this. She's been trying to fix her mistake for 6 years. Mira closed the book. "She made the trials to find someone pure of purpose, someone who would see through the form. She built the whole mechanism because she couldn't undo the curse herself." Elara found Seraphine alone that evening, in the corridor outside the solar. Something in the sorceress's face shifted when she saw her coming. A bracing, almost imperceptible, like someone squaring their shoulders before a blow they have long expected. "I know," Elara said. "Just that." Seraphine looked at her for a long moment. "Then you know the fourth trial. Tell me what it requires." "A choice," freely made, witnessed by the court. Her voice was even, and it cost her something to keep it that way. It cannot be done under compulsion. It cannot be done for a crown. It can only be done because the person decides, fully aware, that they choose him. Elara stood in the cold corridor and thought about warmth under her palms, and a voice that said, I had forgotten what it felt like. What happens if it works? She asked. He returns to his human form. What he remembers, what he is after 6 years, I cannot predict. And if I'm wrong about what I feel? Then the trial fails. We return to where we started. And if I'm right? Seraphine's composure cracked, just slightly, the way fine things crack, a single hairline that revealed everything underneath. Then he comes back, she said, and I have to find the courage to face what I did. The third trial was held in chambers beneath the castle that predated the castle itself. An underground lake. Black water, perfectly still, so that the torches on the stone gallery above were reflected exactly. Sky and water, fire and fire, real and mirror all at once. The challenge? Cross the lake. No boats. The far shore, 40 meters away, barely visible. Behind a sealed door on that shore was a key. The water was deep and cold, and the current beneath the surface was unpredictable. Any light taken in would be extinguished. Darkness, cold, swimming blind. I can see through your eyes, Caelian said, quiet and steady, even in the dark. You can navigate? I can try. Elara pulled off her boots. Beside her, Isolde stood at the water's edge with the expression of a woman who had prepared for everything and had not prepared for this. She sat on the stone edge and put her feet in and bit down on the sound that wanted to come out. Not northern winter cold, something geological. The cold of water that had been underground for centuries, that had never once met sunlight. She dropped in, darkness the moment she submerged. She surfaced, gasping, treaded water, waited for her eyes to adjust. They didn't. There was nothing to adjust to. Swim forward, slightly right. There's a current that will help if you follow it. She swam. The cold was a weight she had to stay ahead of. Her arms ached. She felt the first edge of real panic beginning to rise. The animal panic that said, wrong, 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 not enough air. You're doing well, Caelian said, and there was something in his voice she held on to. Not reassurance, which would have felt hollow, but attention, the quality of someone watching with their whole focus. Left now, hard left. The current splits here. She went left. The pull of the water eased, became almost helpful. How far? Halfway. Maybe more. The door is there. Same cipher marks as the bridge chamber. Different sequence, but the outer ring is sunrise again. She swam in absolute dark, feeling nothing but cold water and burning arms and the rhythm of her stroke, and the warmth at the center of her chest. The only fixed point in all that black. She didn't swim toward the shore. She swam toward him. Close now. Angle right. You'll feel the stone shelf. Her fingers hit rock. She grabbed it, pulled herself up, lay for a moment with her cheek on wet stone, breathing. Well done, Caelian said. Not good girl, not you did it, just well done. With the quality of someone who had watched and was telling her what they had seen. She found the door by touch. Her fingers moved through the cipher marks, and he read them through her hands, the sequence unfolding between them like a conversation they were having simultaneously. The door opened. The key inside was small and iron and inexplicably warm. She went back into the water. She was the first person out. Standing dripping on the gallery stone, she looked up and found Aldrich on the upper level. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had just been asked a question he didn't know how to answer. Their eyes met. She held his gaze until he looked away first. 2 days, Caelian said in her chest. I know, Elara said. I already know. She found him that night, without permission, having taken the spare key from the guard station, while Finn, who had started all of this with his mead and his confused keys, was distracted by cold supper. She sat with her back against the bars and her knees drawn up, facing away from the cell. He sat on his side. The warmth of him at her back was a thing she had stopped pretending she wasn't noticing. Seraphine told me, she said. She cast a displacement curse, meant it for Aldrich. But you were in his chambers. Silence. You've known, she said, not a question. For a while. The memories clarified slowly. She made a mistake. She was afraid and jealous, and she made a terrible mistake. I know what it is to act from the worst version of yourself. You're being generous to the person who put you in this cage. She spent 6 years building an elaborate mechanism to set me free. That is not nothing. She turned all the way around to face the bars. He was close enough that she could have reached through and touched his shoulder. And Aldrich, she said, did he know that you were in there? No. His voice was certain. He found the beast in my chambers and made the only conclusion available to him. He has been punishing what he believed was my killer. He has also been tearing himself apart over it, I think. That is very like him. Elara sat with that. Sat with the image of a king who had spent 6 years hating a creature in a dungeon, not knowing he was hating his own brother. Caelian, she said. What did you look like before? A surprised pause, then wary. Why? Because I've been carrying your heartbeat for weeks. I've read your words in a language dead for 2 centuries. I'm about to make a choice about someone I've never properly seen. She met his red eyes through the bars. So tell me. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Dark hair, gray eyes, the Dre coloring. Aldrich has them too. Tall. A hesitation that felt strange, coming from someone who defaulted to the direct. I was told I was difficult to overlook. Told you I were? I didn't make a habit of looking at myself. Aldrich said I had the kind of face that made enemies before I'd done anything to deserve them. I thought he was being unkind. He said he was being accurate. She looked at the bars, the dark beyond them. Those red eyes. I'm going to need the morning to think, she said. Of course. I'm not saying I haven't already decided. I'm saying I need the morning. The silence that followed was different from all the others. Smaller. Careful. The heartbeat in her chest did something slow and warm, like a fire catching properly after a long time of only smoke. Elara. Just that. Just her name. The way he always said it, like a thing you could hold in your hands and look at. Good night, Caelian, she said, and climbed the stairs back into the castle. She did need the morning, but she had already decided. The court assembled in the great hall at midday, and Elara stood before them in the only dress she owned that didn't belong to a healer. Dark red wool, borrowed from Mira, who had always packed better. Aldrich had found her in the corridor that morning. He'd looked at her with those gray eyes that were not gray when he was feeling things, and said, very quietly, You don't have to do this. I know. Whatever happens. He stopped, started again. He was the better of us. I've known it since I was 9. The jaw tightened. I just want him to be all right. She had nodded. She had not said, I know that too, though she did. Now Seraphine stood before the assembled court with her hands folded and her voice measured. The voice of someone holding themselves together through very long practice. The 4th trial is unlike the others. There is no physical challenge, no cipher to solve. It requires an act of will, freely chosen, witnessed. She looked at Elara. You understand what is being asked? Yes. And you choose to proceed? Yes. A murmur through the court. In the 2nd row, Isolde was watching with an expression Elara had never seen on her face. something open, something that might, in another light, have been the beginning of respect. The far doors opened. Magnus and Finn led Caelian in on chains. Great iron links bolted to a collar she had never seen before, and the sight of it made something move through her chest that had nothing calm about it. He walked between them with the same deliberate stillness she recognized now as his fundamental quality. Not captivity's learned stillness. His. He was choosing every step. His red eyes found her immediately. The court pressed back. Someone made a sound of fear. Elara heard none of it. She walked toward him. "Don't," said one of the other competitors. "You'll be killed." She kept walking. Aldrich made a sharp motion from the dais that stopped the guards from intervening. She stopped in front of Caelian, close enough to feel the heat of him in the winter air of the hall. The chains pulled slack on the stone floor between them, because he hadn't moved, not an inch. "I've been thinking about this all morning," she said, conversationally, as though they were in the dungeon, with bars between them, and not 40 people behind her, holding their collective breath. "And?" His voice, in her chest and in the air around them both. "You're going to be very annoying to argue with when you're human," she said. "You're already annoying now, and I can only hear you in my head." The sound that moved through the hall surprised her. It took a moment to identify it. It was Aldrich. Laughing. A short, stunned sound, quickly controlled. Real. She looked at Caelian, and he was looking at her. And she thought about red eyes by torchlight, and a voice that said, "I had forgotten what it felt like to be touched, without the intent to cause damage." She reached up and placed both hands on either side of his great, dark face, the way she had in the chamber on the very first night, the way that had started all of this. "I choose you," she said. No volume to it, barely a breath. Just the truth, which didn't need to be loud. "Elara," Caelian said. Her name, the way he always said it. The light came from nowhere and everywhere. Not a gentle light. Nothing about what happened was gentle. The chains fell, and the form that had been Caelian for 6 years began to come apart. Not painlessly, not cleanly. The kind of change that takes something through fire to remake it. And she stayed through every second of it, because she had said she would choose him, and this was part of what that meant. She kept her hands on his face. She spoke in Latin, in the old healer's cadence. "I see you. You are not nothing. I am right here." And beneath her palms, she felt the bone and form of him shifting, and her hands shifted with it, and she did not look away. When the light faded, she was kneeling on the stone floor of the great hall, and so was the person she was holding. A man. Dark hair disordered. Eyes closed, and when they opened, gray. Steel gray, not red, the color of the sky outside Ashenvale on a winter morning. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had walked out of a very long dark into light, and could not quite believe the light was real. "Elara," he said, with his real voice. With actual sound. The voice she'd been hearing in her head for weeks. Lower now, rougher, present in the air between them rather than inside her chest. "You sound exactly like I thought you would," she said. Behind her, the hall was entirely silent. Then, from the dais, the sound of boots on stone. Aldrich descended. The court parted. He stopped 3 feet from where they were kneeling, and for a long moment the 2 brothers simply looked at each other. And what passed between them was too large for the hall to contain, too private for any of them to witness properly. Then, Aldrich Dray, King of Dravenmore, dropped to his knees on the stone floor of his own great hall and put his arms around his older brother. He said nothing at all, which was more than anything he could have said. Caelian closed his eyes. His hands, she thought, looking at them, came up and held his brother's back, and the sound he made was very quiet and not meant for anyone else. Elara sat back on her heels and gave them that. She looked up and found Seraphine at the edge of the court, Hands clasped, face completely undone, their eyes met. Elara looked at her steadily, not forgiving, not condemning, and then looked away, and that was enough. Mira materialized from somewhere and sat down on the stone floor beside Elara, with the unconcern of someone for whom a king's great hall was a perfectly reasonable place to sit. "I want it on record," Mira said very quietly, "that I found the book." "Noted. I feel this is not being properly recognized."
"Mira, I'm just saying."
She handed over Elara's cloak. "You looked cold." Elara pulled it around her shoulders and sat on the floor, and felt the thing that had been living in her chest for weeks. The heartbeat that was not hers. The ember, the warmth, beginning, slowly, to change. Deepening. Becoming something that did not feel like a presence at the edge of consciousness. Something that felt, instead, like hers. The library at Ashenvale in February was the warmest room in the castle. Built, generations ago, on top of the kitchen's main chimney stack. Heat came up through the floor stones and made the room smell perpetually of old paper and warmth, which was, Elara had decided, her favorite smell in the world. Caelian was reading. He was always reading, in the hours not claimed by the 100 things required of a returned king. The politics, the court, the delicate work of reassembling a reign presumed ended 6 years ago. When he had a free hour, he came here. Usually, she was already here. They had stopped pretending this was coincidence approximately 6 weeks ago. He read with an intensity she had come to like watching, his attention going completely into whatever he was looking at, the rest of him going very still. A quality she had first encountered in a dungeon dark, and understood now was simply him. It turned out that when Caelian Dre decided something had his attention, it had all of it. She was currently in the category of things that had his attention. She was still working on being comfortable with the scale of that. "You're staring," he said, without looking up. "Observing. There's a distinction, professionally speaking." He looked up. His eyes, gray, warm, and the thing she still wasn't entirely used to was how warm gray could be. Found hers, with the direct precision that was also just him. "What are you observing?" "You favor your right side when you sit." She said it lightly, clinically, the voice she used when she was saying something that mattered and needed to come out looking like it didn't. "Old habit from the shoulder injury. I have something for it." The corner of his mouth moved. That small betrayal at the edges, the places that royal training hadn't quite reached yet. "You're going to make me sit still and apply medicine." "I am." "And tell me it'll only take a moment?" That would be a lie, so no. He held her gaze for one more beat. These pauses that happened often now, that had no purpose except the pausing itself, that neither of them had found a way to talk about directly, and perhaps didn't need to. Then he set his book on the table and moved slightly, to give her access to his shoulder. She crossed to him, pulled out the tin, and settled on the arm of the chair beside his because the angle was better. Because it had been 3 months, and they had not quite arrived at acknowledging what the angle actually was. He was very warm. He ran warmer than any person she'd treated. She'd been noting it since the beginning, and had come to think of it as simply him. One of the indelible facts, like his voice and his eyes and the specific quality of his attention. She worked the ointment into the tension along his shoulder, and he sat completely still in the way he always sat, not enduring, not waiting, actually there, present in the moment. She had learned this was one of the things she liked best about him. He didn't perform patience. He simply was. "Aldrich told me this morning," he said after a while, "that Seraphine has written to him." Her hand stilled, then continued. "From where?" "The Sisters of the Mountain Shrine, near the Voss border." "She's been working, healing." She asked whether he was well. Elara thought about a woman who had spent 6 years building an elaborate mechanism of penance. What will he do? I don't know. The honest admission, He was generous with those she'd found, never performing certainty he didn't have. I told him it was his decision. Whatever she did to me, she also spent 6 years trying to undo it. You said that before. Months ago, through bars, in dungeon dark. I meant it then, too. She finished her work, capped the tin, and sat there, on the arm of his chair, with the February library warm around them, and the snow outside, and the smell of paper and hearth smoke, and did not immediately move away. He did not suggest she should. Mira, she said finally, wants to know if she can use the cipher chamber to practice her Old Dravinian. She's learned Old Dravinian? She was already learning it. She says it's more useful than people think. Magnus has been teaching her, apparently. A silence. Then, Magnus is teaching her Old Dravinian. That's what she said. Magnus, he said slowly, who has not, in 22 years of service to this family, done anything voluntarily that did not serve a direct, tactical purpose. The same, he looked at the ceiling. Tell her she's welcome to use the chamber. Tell Magnus I said he's doing valuable work. She felt it rise in her chest. Helpless warmth, slow and unmanageable, and had to look at the window, the pale winter light, to compose herself. When she looked back, he was watching her with the specific quality that meant he had caught exactly what she'd been trying to hide. He said nothing. He picked up his book, but he moved, almost imperceptibly, just enough, so that they were slightly closer than they had been. Their shoulders not quite touching, just adjacent, just sharing the warmth between them. He returned to his reading, and she returned to her not reading, and the library held them both in its warmth, like something that had been waiting a long time to be exactly this. The heartbeat she had carried for months, that steady, not hers warmth at the center of her chest, had never left. She had thought it would fade when the curse broke, that it was the magic, something temporary. It had not faded. She had stopped wondering why. Some things didn't need explaining. Some things were simply facts. Cold northern winters, and old paper smells, and the particular warmth of sitting close to someone who runs warm, and a shared heartbeat that had started in a dungeon and had not seen any good reason to stop. She turned a page of her book. Outside, February snow fell soft and steady on Ashenvale. Inside, something that had been broken for 6 years was, quietly and without ceremony, becoming whole. Elara Voss walked into a dark chamber by accident, carrying nothing but a candle stub and a satchel of herbs. She was not brave in the way stories usually describe bravery, loud and certain and armored. She was brave in the quieter way. She looked at what frightened her, and she noticed the wounds instead. That is the whole story. Not the curse, not the trials. Not even the slow, careful thing that grew between two people across dungeon bars and library tables and a winter's worth of words passed through a crack in a wall. The story is about what happens when someone refuses to see a monster, not because they are naive, not because they are fearless, but because they are paying attention. Because they understand that the most important question is never, "What is this?" but "Who is this?" and what has been done to them. Caelian Dre spent 6 years in the dark because everyone who came close saw a beast. Elara came close and saw the scars. She saw the intelligence. She saw the person who was still, against every reason to have stopped, trying to reach back. She chose him. Not out of obligation, not out of a contract, not because a trial required it. She chose him because she had learned who he was in the dark, and she decided that person was worth choosing in the light. That is what real love looks like when you strip away the ceremony. It is not the moment you see someone at their best. It is the moment you see someone at their most broken, and you don't look away. You look at the wounds, and you stay. If something in this story stayed with you, a moment, a line, a feeling you can't quite name yet, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments, genuinely. Those messages are why the next story gets made. Like if it moved you, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming, and thank you for spending this time here. Stories like this only matter because people like you are willing to listen.